Okay, my friends, to enter into the space of understanding what the 10 plagues are and to understand that they aren't random events that Hashem decided, you know what, let me just show my dominion upon the Egyptians, let me show my omnipotence and express some change of nature, and I'll choose some random things. We are told that these particular plagues were aimed surgically to remove the partitions of the Mitzrim, of the Egyptians. What we see is brought down in the Haggadah. It says, Eile asar makos shehevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu ala Mitzrim b'Mitzrayim. These are the 10 makos, these are the 10 plagues or afflictions that Hashem brought upon the Egyptians in Egypt. And what are they? So I know you're looking for sources. There's no sources printed. You will be able to find them on your phones, though. So the question is, what does it mean initially? These are the 10 plagues that Hashem inflicted upon the Egyptians in Egypt. Why do I have to know that it's upon the Egyptians in Egypt? Wouldn't I infer that's already in Egypt? Strange statement. So what we can gather from this, from get-go, is that this is an infliction upon the Egyptians in Egypt, which means this is at their hub. This is the epicenter of what it means to be an Egyptian. And what we know that an Egyptian represents is ultimate constriction, ultimate boundary, ultimate detachment. As we know, Mitzri comes from Meitzar. Meitzar or Meitzarim, Mitzriim, is the space of constricted space, that I feel like I am constricted. And what the Egyptians were essentially doing were constricting us. Now, what does it mean to be constricted? What it means to be constricted, we understand, is that when a person doesn't have access to the expansivity of their soul, they feel constricted. And they're looking for different mechanisms to give them a sense of expansivity. So they go traveling, they eat, they experience things in terms of entertainment, relationships. That gives them a sense of expansion, as we've learned when we studied about the dimensions or the secret dimensions of Adam. But this, we understand, is a constriction that transpires when we are detached from our soul, which is by definition expansive. Now, these particular plagues, we know, are not just random in the sense that there are 10. I mean, 10 is a very cool number. We have 10 commandments. 10 is required for a minyan. What is so unique about 10? And why is this a particular number that Hashem decided to use? So we know that 10 is particularly relevant when we speak about the spiritual energy of the soul, because we have 10 emanations of spiritual energy. We have 10 centers of spiritual energy. And what Hashem was doing was he was unpacking, unblocking each particular energy force through the plagues. So tonight, what we're going to do is go through the plagues in order to understand where was there a constriction within the spiritual realm and how was it unblocked. And thus, when we read the plagues, we're not only going to be reading about this cool thing that transpired so many years ago, but we're going to be reading about the affliction that we might be experiencing in our own life and the potential rectification of that blockage. Yeah. So let's start off. It says like this. What were the 10 plagues? So the 10 plagues in order was dam, blood, Sfardea, frogs, Kinim, lice, Aroiv, wild animals, Dever, plague, which afflicted the animals, Shchin, which is boils, Barad, which is hail, Arbe, which is locusts, Choshech, which is darkness, and Makais b'choiros, which is the plague or the striking of the firstborn. Again, very random. I mean, if we were to come up with 10 plagues to strike the Egyptians, do you think we could do better? What would you pick there? If you could pick a plague, what would you choose?
Maybe.
So just they would be stuck in their tracks. They couldn't walk. They would be paralyzed. That would be a pretty hectic plague to afflict the Egyptians with. Jesse, I'm sure you could come up with something more fanciful than kitniot. No kitniot is already a plague enough for the Ashkenazim. So what on earth is going on here? Why are these particular plagues that are transpiring? So let's start off with the first sphere. The first sphere we know in the Jewish realm is something called Malchus. Malchus is the realm of kingship, or more appropriately known as queenship. And queenship is the manifest energy of spirituality into the physical. And it is the first base and the last base of all spiritual energy. It comes up from that base and it comes back down to earth into that space. Now, what we are told in the Midrash Tanchuma, it says that the Eser Makos Kulan Mida Keneged Mida. The Midrash tells us that every single affliction that transpired was a measure for measure. Now, it wasn't a tit for tat. Understand that Hashem doesn't work tit for tat. This was a measure for measure, meaning that what was there needed to be healed with this particular measure. Now, the Midrash asks, Dam, all right, cool. The plague of Dam, which is blood. Lama hevi alav Dam, why was it brought? Why was it necessary for there to be a plague of blood? What was this a measure for measure? So the Midrash tells us something crazy. It says that the Egyptians never allowed the Jewish women, never allow the Jewish women to go to the mikveh, never allow the Jewish women to ritually immerse, to purify themselves from their impurity of menstruation, in order that they shouldn't be intimate with their spouses. That's what the Midrash tells us. The Midrash says the reason why the Egyptians were afflicted, and particularly the Nile was hit and transformed into blood, is that the Nile was this energy force that we know the women would be able to go to the mikveh in. It would purify them from the impurity of blood. So this was a midah keneged midah, a measure for measure against the Egyptians, that they should now have their Nile transformed, their purity transformed into impurity, into blood. Crazy concept. What the Kabbalists tell us is this is the first step. The first step to unblocking any spiritual energy is the ability in yourself, in your physical self, to have some form of shedding of blood. What shedding of blood looks like, and this is how Rabbi Nachman brings it, is it looks like in the form of waiting. Anytime you need to wait for something physically, you are shedding your own blood. You are somewhat sacrificing your physical self for your spiritual self. When you want to eat in Judaism, you need to wait. You need to wash your hands. You need to say a blessing. When you want to engage with food straight away in the morning, you need to wait. You have to daven first. When it comes to intimacy as well, between husband and wife, there are periods of time where you have to wait. In fact, the sin of Adam and Eve, we are told, was because they didn't wait. If they would have waited to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil until Shabbos, it would have been perfectly acceptable. All they had to do is wait a few hours. And because of that, we are stuck waiting for many, many millennium until Mashiach comes. We are waiting. But in our own lives, anytime a person is able to sit in the waiting, which is very unpleasant, especially today, to sit in the waiting and to sacrifice, that is considered a spilling of blood. That is the first step that is able to then undermine the energy of blockage of the Egyptian that can't wait. It's all about physicality for the Egyptian. That's the first. The second one is the plague of frogs. Before we continue, anyone understand what we just said about the plague of blood? Yeah, it makes sense how this plague is coming to afflict the Egyptians who didn't want to allow the Jewish people this energy of waiting, this sacred energy of family purity. That's what they were hit with. And it says, interestingly, that for the Jews, when they picked up the blood and they poured it into their mouths, it turned into water. But for the Egyptians, the water turned into blood. And what the most unbelievable concept is there is that for a spiritual person, the moments of waiting are some of the most sublime opportunities. For a person who's detached from spirituality, the moments of waiting are some of the most unpleasant moments in their life. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one we know is the plague of frogs. Why the plague of frogs? Out of all different plagues we could have chosen, all different animals or interesting creatures we could have experienced, reptiles. What are those reptiles? Those that look like dragons. What are those types of reptiles? The kimono dragon. Imagine kimonos. That would be unbelievable to have kimono dragons walking around. Isn't there something to do with their saliva or their spit? There's an energy. It's poisonous saliva. Now we're talking. This is a proper plague, not a frog. What has it got to do with frogs? So we are told that these frogs, apart from any time the Egyptians struck one of these frogs, which it says there was only one that emerged from the Nile, it would multiply. But we are told as well that these frogs embedded themselves into every environment known to the Egyptians. It went everywhere it could go. They found frogs in their dough. They found frogs in their ovens. They found frogs everywhere. But what this particular energy force represents is the energy of noise. Frogs, you can imagine, you hear this one frog, just constant noise. Imagine thousands upon thousands upon thousands of frogs just in the vicinity that you're in, and the amount of noise that's there. Now, what this interestingly represents in terms of a spiritual energy, where the previous energy we were talking about manifestation into the physical realm. And to be able to manifest physically, you need to be able to have dominion over your physical self. I went to see a physio the other day, and this is a physio that has unbelievable abilities of sensing energy. And I asked the physio, I said to them, Levi, the physio, I said to them, how is it that you are able to tap into this ability? And you know what he said to me? He said to me that he does it through fasting. Out of all of the answers that he could have said, he does it through fasting. Fasting out of all of the things. And I thought to myself, 100%, when a person has dominion over body, dominion over physicality, that's when you can have manifest spiritual energy. That's the first step. The second step is a vital energy force, and that's the energy of intimate connectivity with the world. Now, we are constantly searching for connectivity. This is the energy force called Yesod. Yesod is the secret of life. And we are searching for that so incessantly that has transformed our experience of life into noise. Because we are so looking for this energy and at the same time so lacking in it. There is so much noise that is either distracting or trying to fulfill us in whatever capacity. To the extent, I know many people, they'll wake up in the morning, switch on the TV, and start their day. And you ask them, so what's going on the TV? No clue. So why is the TV on? I just need noise. I need noise in the background. I need something there. What's going on? We need noise to give us a false sense of cooing our reality into feeling connected. And these frogs represented the noise of life when a person doesn't have deep connectivity to what's in front of them and to the moment that's in front of them, or to a deep relationship in front of them. And what's interesting is the Baal Shem Tov tells us the word for frog is tzfardeya. Tzfardeya is made up of two Hebrew words, tzafar Daya. Safar means light or clear, and Daya comes from Das, which means knowledge, intimate knowledge. When a person has Safar Daya, when a person has clarity of knowledge, deep connectivity, that removes the noise. To the extent that you can be in the most noisy circumstance, but because you deeply know and you're deeply present, it doesn't shake you. But the Egyptians, on the other hand, were so frivolous with their deep, intimate knowledge of life and in front of what's in front of them, that then their life was subsumed with promiscuity and with noise. That's why the word safar also can be rearranged to spell paratz or pritzus, which is the word to break free of the fencing of life, to break free of that which is in front of you and engage with it deeply and go off into the expanse, into the unknown where there's nothing of substance. And this is what the energy of the Tzafardaya particularly represents, in that we know the frog out of all energy forces is cold-blooded. And that cold-blooded component of the frog represents the inability to connect, the inability to be present. Okay, so the second step after having dominion over our body is finding deep intimacy with the moment that's in front of you, zoning in fully to what you're experiencing, or even having moments where you're engaging with someone and you're just deeply present in yourself, deeply present. Clarity of knowledge is the second step. And the Egyptians who didn't have this were struck by this particular energy. The next one is the energy of kinim. Now, before we get to the energy of kinim, Rabbi Nachman tells us a very powerful piece about the frogs. And he says that these frogs entered into every corner of the home. And he says the way to fix our lack of knowing is to have a voice expressed of song and knowledge and prayer to Hashem in every corner of your home. That just like those frogs filled every single element and every single aspect of the Egyptians' homes, we have to counter that with our own spiritual frog, so to speak. And does anyone know what is the song of the frog? We know that every single animal has a particular song. What song does the frog sing? The song of the frog is Baruch Shem Kevod Malchusoi Le'olam Va'ed. Unbelievable. The song of the frog is a terminology that we say every day in the Shema, but not only every day in the Shema. If one was to take the first letters of Baruch Shem Kevod Malchusoi Le'olam Va'ed, these are all letters base. Shin, Chaf, Lamed, all of these letters are prefixes. And when a person, and this is a fundamental secret, if you want to feel connection to the moment in front of you, is turn yourself into a prefix. See life from the perspective that you are the prefix for this experience. See life as you are the prefix for engaging with the godliness that is in that moment and in that person. And that's what's going to allow you to tap into the Tzafardaya. And that's what will allow you to fill every space of your home with song and with prayer. Third level. What were they? What was the third plague? Lice. Okay, so what is the energy of lice? So what does lice make you feel? Itchy. And where particularly? In your hair. So what does it mean to feel an itchiness in your hair? So what the Kabbalists reveal is the itchiness, and it's a very unpleasant experience to have the itchiness the itchiness of the hair. And you see this with the kids, it's one of the most dangerous things in a school. A kid has lice, it's like out, there's some plague of an untold nature in the school. It's a scary thing. Kid comes home, it's very, very serious stuff. And what does it mean to have lice in the hair? So what we are told is that hair represents the excretion of the mind. And what hair represents in that sense is thinking. But what thinking creates an itchiness? And the Kabbalists reveal that thinking that is over inundated and subsumed by what other people are thinking of you. This is the energy of lice. When a person is subsumed in focusing on what other people are thinking of you, you are being struck by the plague of lice. Now, yes?
It's interesting that some people say that nose is itchy, ears itchy, someone's talking about you.
Yeah, interesting. Now, what's the Hebrew word for lice? Kinim. Now, what's interesting is that the terminology kinim is found in reference to the brothers of Joseph. And the word kinim, we see in the verse in Bereshis, it says, Kulanu b'nei ish echad, we are all sons of one man, nachnu, kainim anachnu. And the way it's translated here is, we are being honest. But kainim, in a more literal definition, if you take the word kainim, what Hebrew word is found in the word kainim? The word ken. What's ken? Yes. Now, what is a yes, especially that it's now in plural? A double yes is an individual who becomes a yes man. What's a yes man or a yes woman? It's a person who is constantly trying to please others because they are afraid of what that person or others will think of them. And what this energy is called is the energy of Hoid. Hoid comes from humility. And within Kainim is a very powerful energy. Because if we take the energy of Hoid, what Hoid in a healthy expression represents is saying yes to life, is saying yes to self, is saying yes to my circumstance. It's referred to as sublimation and gratitude. It's all about saying yes, Kainim. What happens when a person doesn't have healthy Hoid is it turns into unhealthy humility. And unhealthy humility is over-obsession with what other people are thinking of you. What's interesting is the lice themselves were so insignificant. It says they had no dominion, or the Egyptians had no dominion over the lice. They were of an insignificant nature. They couldn't actually manifest these lice themselves. So much so that if a person has a louse on Shabbos, are you allowed to kill insects on Shabbos? No. Can you kill lice on Shabbos? The answer is yes. Crazy concept. Why is that such? And the answer is because lice have no essence. There is nothing, no substance to them. And if an individual understands that the danger of self is when they lose the substance of self, and they don't see the intrinsic value of self, and they start to place their required value on the perception of others, that's when their hair starts to get itchy. That's when the thoughts and the obsessions of what does this person think of me start to inundate them. The alternative to that is removing all obsession of self and saying yes to life, sublimating to life, being grateful for life. And this is the particular energy force of the kinim. It's interesting that they came from the dirt. And dirt, we know, is particularly associated with depression. And an individual who is overly obsessed with other people's perceptions, overly scratching their head because of what they're thinking about other people thinking of them, is an individual that has depression and will lead to that space of depression. A person who's unable to say yes to life, to be a Canaan, not to be a yes man, but a yes to life man. That's what allows a person to evolve out of this particular blockage of the lice. Yeah. The prefix that we saw of the frogs is that a prefix in the Hebrew terminology, if you look at the words in Hebrew, they have prefixes. So there are letters that are prefixes, like a lamed, le, means to go to, or a vav means and. So these are letters that you attach to other words, which is a prefix. When you see yourself as an attachment to life, when you see yourself as I'm a prefix to the way that life is manifesting, I then in that circumstance am able to connect to the moment that I'm in. But if I'm life, then I'm going to struggle with the connectivity. Imagine in a conversation, imagine you're the one that's constantly thinking what you want to say. Are you going to be able to connect deeply with the person that's in front of you? What we see by the frogs is the depth of connectivity comes from being a prefix. That's all we saw in that particular level. Conduit, exactly. Okay, let's go to the fourth one. Yeah.
Explanation.
So we see this terminology of Canaan. We see this terminology of yes men. Yeah, we are being honest. Trust us. We're okay. We're good. Don't judge us negatively. That's what we're seeing here is this obsession of the lice. Okay, the fourth one, aroiv, which is these wild animals. Now, if you were to choose a wild animal, okay, we've already chosen the kimono, but I think that should be in the reptile section with the frogs. What wild animal would you choose? Many different wild animals to go for. Levi, which one would you choose? You would choose the hyena, yes, especially I think I've got an image of the hyena on our poster. Very ugly. I mean, so beautifully ugly. You see a hyena so ugly, but it's beautiful in how ugly it is. But you know what? I'm telling you, if I reveal the following animal to you, you would choose it. There's no question. This is the best animal out of all the animals that you could have chosen. What you would choose down there? What would you choose?
Me.
Yes. A pig. You would have chosen a pig. Out of all wild animals, that's a cute. You would say a wild pig, a boar. I hear, but neither is a hyena. But check this animal out. We are told that one of the most fanciful and unique animals that were brought into Egypt was something called the Adonai Hasadeh. The Adonai Hasadeh. What on earth is the Adonai Hasadeh? So check out. No, this is nowhere near a giraffe. And giraffe is kosher, by the way. Says here, look at the Mishnah in Klayim. If you think I'm making this up, it's a Mishnah. It says, "Va'adnei Hasadeh Chaya." There's a argument in the Mishnah. Do we look at a Adonai Hasadeh, this entity, this creature? How do we define its impure status? Meaning, if an animal dies, there's no impurity. But if a human dies, we have something called tumah. Now, an Adonai Hasadeh, which we haven't really defined yet, but this is a nice intro into its definition. The Gemara or the Mishnah is in a quandary of how to define an Adonai Hasadeh. And it says, the way it's translated in the English, the wild man-like creature. Wild man-like creature. How do we define it? Is it a wild animal or is it a human being? So Rabbi Yossi held it was a human being. And it would create tumas oihalim. It would create impurity in the tent if it died in that tent. But you would have to be very skilled to kill an Adonai Hasadeh, because the Bar Tanura tells us what it was. Check out what the Bar Tanura tells us. It says that the Adonai Hasadeh, the name of a mythical animal, an orangutan, a Bigfoot, a large wildlife in the fields, and like a kind of large rope that comes out from the ground in which this wildlife was raised. So it seems it was attached by an umbilical cord. It's much better in the Hebrew. It grew from this rope, grew from this umbilical cord. Ushma Yadua, we know that its name was known. It was referred to as a Yidoni. Where do we see this in the Torah? That there was a practice called the Yidonim who would serve idolatry. And the way that they would serve idolatry was they would take the Adnei Asadeh, this wild, half human, half earth, natural entity, wild creature that was attached with an umbilical cord to the ground. And it says anything in its radius. He writes here, there was no way to kill it. The Baratanura tells us. No way to kill it. It looked like a human being, and no entity could come close to it. Because it would kill it. And rip anything apart that would come in its radius. Valdik. You want that as your guard at the front of your house, yeah? No, this is another level of entity. That's the Mishnah, and the Bartanura is explaining it to us further. Now check out what the Yidoni was. The only way to catch a Yidoni or an Adnei Asadeh was to sever its umbilical cord from the ground. So they would shoot arrows at the umbilical cord to sever it. It would cry out with a bitter cry and die immediately. And this is already brought down in Eov, in Job. So this was a mythical creature that existed. It's brought down in the Mishnah. If you sold your land to someone, let's say you had a farm, and on the farm, you sometimes have holes and pits and, different swamps. There were discussions if you had an Yidoni, an Adnei Asadeh on your farm, would that be considered part of the sale? Because, no one's going to buy that area. So is it part of the sale or not? So why am I telling you this? The reason why I'm telling you this is this was the poster child of all of the animals of the Aroim. If you were to talk about wild animals and you wanted to put a poster child there of the wild animal, you would have Yidoni at the front. This was the famous Aroim that was brought down into Egypt. Can you imagine waking up and having these, humanoids connected with umbilical cords to the ground, just ripping anything around in its radius? I mean, that's a pretty freaky thing to experience. Why am I telling you this? So the fourth level, we are told, is the energy of Netzach. The energy of Netzach is a spiritual energy of tenacity, of accomplishment. But the danger is when it turns you into a Yidoni. The danger is when it turns you into the Adnei Asadeh. What that means is a person who becomes subsumed by their connectivity to the land, to the earth, that their umbilical cord is directly attached to the ground, which means they get their source of energy from their next accomplishment. And however much they are accomplishing, then they feel good about themselves. If they're not accomplishing, they feel completely like they want to devour and destroy. This is the energy of Netzach. What do you want to say? B'nai Ishmael, but this energy also exists within ourselves. This is the energy of overachieving, of over-focus on doing. That this is where the individual completely is subsumed by their definition of being attached to the ground. That is what turns them into this territorial, insanely devouring creature that nothing can stop it. Nothing can stand in its way or rip you up. Very dangerous energy to have.
What is the source of regeneration?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, the question would be how it would survive the flood of Noah. If it's attached to the ground with an umbilical cord, it's surely drowned. Maybe it has the ability to breathe under the water. I'm not sure. It seems that it's something that God had created, but it's there to teach us about this energy that when we are too attached to doing and achieving and ground, this is what we turn into as human beings. And that's the ability to conquer this idoni is detaching it from its state of doing, detaching it from its state of accomplishment. Yeah. So let's go to the fifth one. And that is then the energy of Dever. Okay. Dever, we know, is the affliction or the plague that struck all the animals. Now, what is brought down by Rabbi Nachman is Dever is particularly associated with the energy force called Tiferes. Tiferes is something of beauty. It's something of balance. It's something of harmony. Now, I ask you, in your own life, when do you experience beauty, balance, and harmony? When a person generally thinks about beauty, balance, and harmony, it's when there is beauty, balance, and harmony all around them. When you're in a very beautiful environment that's harmonious, that's peaceful, you've got nothing to worry about, everything's in order, everything's in check. Now I feel a sense of beauty, harmony. That's essentially the concept of beauty when everything is perfectly aligned. Now, what we are told about this particular plague is that it afflicted all of the animals. They just dropped dead. Now, what was unique about it was there was no warning that was given to Pharaoh. And not only that, the general utilization of the plague would exist for a few days, minimum. This plague came and went in an instant. And it shook Pharaoh to his core. Yeah. Well, it affected him because his prosperity, what made him feel good, was when he looked out into the fields and he saw all of his, pastures filled with the cattle and the flock that he owned. That was your wealth. When he looked out now and all the animals were struck and killed, he had complete instability. He had no harmony because his external world was of an unstable nature. And what we're learning from this particular energy force is when a person has the ability to say, whatever happens to me in life is meant to happen and is perfectly happening to me from Hashem, then they have the ability to have stability. An individual that has their own presumption of what beauty is, what harmony is, how things have to be in order for you to then feel okay, is a person that doesn't live harmoniously. And this is the energy that struck Pharaoh. That it happened, it hit him, and he didn't know where it came from, and he didn't know where it went. He didn't even have control over the plague itself. Other ones he knew, he liked, okay, it's coming, all right, big deal, but okay, I'll have to sit with it. It'll be a few weeks, He had at least time to plan. For this, he had no time to plan. And that shook him to his core. So the fifth energy that we've learned is the ability to find beauty and harmony by saying, I don't see the holistic picture, but I know it's part of the tapestry and one of the most beautiful tapestries of life. And that's what then allows you to find the harmony and the beauty in every moment of your experience, even when it looks out of whack. The next one, we're coming closer to the end, is Shchin. Shchin was boils. Now, what is this energy of boils? So we're told like this, something very fascinating. The source that I've brought for you that engages with this particular energy tells us like this. I didn't bring this source regarding the previous energy. We won't go into it, actually. Let's have a look at boils. Boils tells us what was unique about the boils is that the boils were dry on the inside and wet on the outside. Dry on the inside and wet on the outside. Why is that such a fascinating and unique aspect? So what the Kabbalists reveal to us is this. Boils comes from the energy of discipline and anger. This is an energy which is referred to in Kabbalah as Gvura. Gvura is the space of dominion, but it's also the space of being able to have healthy boundaries. Now, what happens if an individual doesn't engage with this energy in the correct way? Is they start to take the energy of when they're able to say, this is wrong and this is right. This is a boundary that I have to make for myself. When they don't have the ability to institute healthy boundaries, what starts to happen is that energy of wrong starts to eat them up from the inside. It starts to boil them up from the inside. And that's what the boils represent, that there was this heat internally that started to create a boil. Now, what that heat then did was dry them out from the inside. Because what a person is doing in this energy force of wrong and negative and boundaries is they're experiencing hatred. They're starting to take the energy of boundary, which is a healthy energy, and they're transforming it into an energy of anger and hatred. Anger and hatred for self, and then anger and hatred for others and everything else around. And this is what is represented by a person who is dry on the inside. They've dried themselves out with all of the fire that they've been putting onto themselves. That anger and that hatred for self starts to dry themselves out. And that is the energy of the boil, which on the outside was wet. What that means that it was wet on the outside was they get some vitality from the externality. They get some vitality from the experience of the external self. But the internal self is something that has become dry. And this is the energy of the boil, which one could refer to as the inflammation of the soul, where the soul is dried out because of all of this energy of hatred and negativity that creates this energy of the boil, which creates a space of frustration. So how do you heal the boil? The way to heal the boil, Rabbi Nachman writes, is you have to dig within to find your inner wellspring. You have to revitalize and moisturize yourself from within. You have to create moisture from within. And moisture from within comes from this intrinsic love, this fountain of life that exists within. When a person has a disconnected experience from that fountain of life, it turns into these boils. So he says, dig deeper and deeper and deeper until you find that moisture of self, and that's going to heal the boil. The final four we'll go through them a little bit quicker, is the energy of Arbe. Arbe was the locusts. Now, what were these locusts? What were these locusts coming to teach us? What were they coming to achieve? We're told, interestingly, about these locusts that they were blown in with a wind, and they were all blown into Egypt. And also what was interesting was the Egyptians managed to utilize them after. What did they do, it says, with the locusts? They marinated them in salt, or they pickled the locusts. Yeah, imagine going down to buy some pickled gherkins. Here we had pickled locusts, yes? Barad. Yeah, we're going to get to Barad. Oh, sorry, we skipped Barad. Yes, thank you for that. Yes, appreciate that. So before we come to the pickled locusts, let's deal with the energy of Barad. So Barad is the energy of Chesed. Chesed is the energy of love. And the energy of love is very much associated with water, because water is this sustaining entity. It flows down to the lowest place. It's a very selfless energy force. It's able to create or morph itself into the environment that it's in. It's a beautiful substance. It's translucent. It's sustaining. What's barad? Barad is that water entity that's become frozen. And when that water entity becomes frozen, it doesn't become a sustaining entity, it becomes a damaging force. It becomes something of danger. It becomes something that pummels itself down into the ground and can break things. And what this represents is a person that is subsumed with selfish love. When love isn't a healthy expression of itself, when it's not like water that's coming to sustain the environment that's around, to engage in a translucent way with the space that it's in. When it becomes selfish, it becomes detached, it becomes damaging. And this is what we refer to as love, that is a dependency, when a person starts to use their love and they become dependent on someone else for that experience of love. Or when that love becomes self-serving and it's only about the love that you have for yourself. This is the danger of this barad. Now, what's crazy is if you think about the coldness of this water, it represents the experience when a person is so detached with their love that they start to feel a coldness in life. They start to feel a lackluster experience of love in their life because it's all about themselves. So they don't actually have an openness in that experience. What's interesting about the barad is what was inside of it? There was fire. It says that the barad had within it, it had flames, fire. And the Midrashim tell us that when the Egyptians were hit by the barad, when they got back up, they got burnt by the fire. What does that mean on a Kabbalistic level? What that means on a Kabbalistic level is that a person who is detached from true love in life, person that doesn't have that healthy expression of love in their life, they don't have the energy of chesed. They can't go out of themselves. They can't live life outside of themselves. They can't do anything for anyone other than themselves. They start to feel cold. And what happens after that cold is unhealthy fire. What unhealthy fire is the flame of passion and addiction. When a person becomes so selfish in their desire for love, it turns into unhealthy passion and addiction, and that is represented by the fire. Okay, and that's what the barad represents. Coming to the arbe, we come into the final three, where these first seven that we engaged with, they are particularly found in their reference to the seven different emotional energies of the sfirot that we've gone through. These are all seven different emotions: love, anger, harmony, humility, gratitude, all of these spaces, ambition. These are all different emotional energies that exist in a person. Loneliness, emptiness, not being able to be patient. All of these energies we engage with in reference to these particular aspects of those first seven plagues. The final three are broken up into a separate parasha, where we see the first seven are discussed in the one parasha. The next parasha that follows in the Torah discusses the final three. And the reason is because these final three now enter into the mind and enter into the conscious self. Because once you've been able to overcome all of these seven energies that we've gone through, once you've been able to be an individual that is able to overcome your physical self and then be totally present in the moment and exist as a prefix to experience of life, and then come into saying yes to life and having a sublimation to life and not being over obsessed with what people are thinking about you, but rather being so inundated, or not inundated, so connected to life that you don't even care about what's going on around you in terms of people's thoughts of negativity. Obviously, we have to be sensitive to people. But the fourth level we then saw was healthy ambition, not being overly attached to the ground. And then the final two within those spaces we saw was the energy of healthy boundary, where that boundary doesn't turn into inner hatred of self and inner angst and anger. And then that final energy of being the energy of chesed, being able to live outside of yourself as well, being able to give to others, not only to the self, is that energy of hail. Once a person has rectified all of these spaces and unblocked them, which is essentially why the Egyptians were being struck, because they were blocked in these areas, we come to the final three. And the final three is the arbe. So the arbe is the locusts. What the locusts represents is that they came in swarms. And in their swarms, they devoured everything that was green and edible. All the natural environment was destroyed by these parasites, by these entities that completely came in and destroyed all the produce. Now, what was interesting was they were brought by a wind, and further interesting was they were pickled by the Egyptians. Why do we need to know these particular aspects? What was so important about these things? So what the Kabbalists revealed to us is the locusts represent our thoughts or our mind of thinking. Okay, where the previous one, where we dealt with Hoid and over-obsession with people and what they're thinking about us, that was an emotional energy of not feeling good about yourself, feeling empty or feeling low about self. This is a mental energy. The locusts are these swarms of thought that overcome the experience of nutritious, enjoyable, sustainable produce of life. They come in and they swarm you. Now, how do they swarm you? The first one is they cause you to overthink. They cause you to think that your experience of life is only when you're thinking, only when you're engaging with thought. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. We think that if you only think, then you exist. But what we have to understand in Judaism is you're existing already beyond your think. And the ability to not overthink is a fundamental ability which the Egyptians didn't have the ability to do. And what it represents here is that the Egyptians took this particular space and they pickled them. What does it mean that they came to pickle them? What does it mean to pickle something? So when you pickle something, it sits. And it sits in that jar and it stays in that jar. It sometimes ferments. What it means is the mind itself, when it is locked in its constant perpetual cycle of thought, is it becomes pickled. And the inability to break out of the thinking is the inability to break through the plague of locusts, where a person's mind is subsumed with thought and it stays in one particular direction and it stays in that jar and they can't break out of that particular way of thinking, is represented by the locusts. The final two, the energy of choshech. Choshech, we are told, was a debilitating darkness. And the darkness, we are told, in the Midrash, in Shmois Rabbah, the Midrash asks, what was the darkness analogous to? What was the darkness analogous to? And you know what it says? Midrash tells us, Kama haya oisa choshech. How dark was the darkness? Well, how much of the darkness was there? Rabbi Seinu Amru. The rabbis tell us, Ave, it was as thick kedinar haya. It was as thick as a coin, which is referred to as a dinar. Why on earth would you use an analogy of a coin to give you an analogy for darkness or how thick the darkness was? So we are told that Moses extends his hands up into the heavens to bring this darkness down. And this darkness was in fact an immensely powerful light that came from the supernal energies of the Olam Lemaila, the upper world. Now, in that darkness, there was such a powerful energy of spirituality. But to an individual that was not used to that energy, it created the greatest darkness. As you know, if a person shines light into your eyes where they're not used to the light, it's sometimes the greatest darkness. Now, what has this got to do with the dinar, with the coin? So what this particular energy force of darkness is in line with is the spiritual energy called chokhmah. What is chokhmah? So we've just done something called bina, which is our thoughts, which is our ability to consider and conceptualize or have within our intellect thoughts, to compare and contrast. That's what the locust represents, and not to over compare and contrast before you get completely inundated by those locusts, pickled in your mind. The next level is the level of wisdom, which is chokhmah. Wisdom is the level of consciousness. Now, consciousness, what does it mean to be a conscious person? What does it mean to have consciousness? What it means to have consciousness is you experience, just through your experience of life, you experience expansion through just the presence of engaging with what's in front of you. When a person comes to the recognition that everything that they see in front of them is subsumed with that of infinity, with that of godliness, your experience of what's in front of you is expansive by definition. It is constantly expanding. It's constantly giving you more. It's this never-ending experience. That's what consciousness is. You don't have to go anywhere when you're conscious because everything's already there. Now, when a person doesn't have consciousness, they replace it with something else. What do they replace it with? What else gives a person the experience of expansivity? Things, money. And that's what it means. How dark, how thick was the darkness? It was thick as money. To say like this, a person without consciousness and expansivity replaces that with the darkness and the delusion that they can experience expansivity through more money. And it becomes an obsession with making more and an obsession with how much they have. And this is the danger of an individual that doesn't have consciousness, is they are debilitated in their experience of life because they're not experiencing the expansivity of life, which is by definition extant just by being conscious. The final level is the level of Makos B'choros. Makos B'choros, the plague of the firstborn, is the final plague. And this final plague was the liberation of the Jewish people. That if they had not gone through this final plague, they would not have been liberated. They couldn't have left. What does this final plague represent? So the Baal Shem Tov reveals to us like this. The energy of this final plague is commensurate to the spiritual energy called meta-conscious. The previous level was just being conscious. The final level of spiritual freedom, which is this is what this is all about, is feeling liberated, is not feeling blocked in the self, which is all about feeling expansive, feeling flow, feeling the space of at ease and connected. The final level is something that is referred to as meta-consciousness. Meta-consciousness is the part of self where you completely let go and you become nullified into all. That you don't see yourself even in existence anymore because you're part of existence. You become part of the conglomerate. You become part of the holistic. You become nullified in everything. The opposite of that is the firstborn. The firstborn represents, the Baal Shem Tov says, is the individual that seeks to find that sense of feeling at ease and at one with being in control. The Bechor is that anxious self that is trying to protect its own existence. The Bechor is this energy that makes you constantly think you need to choose. to keep yourself safe. The Bechor is the firstborn, which is considered the most responsible. I'm not saying that that's always the case, but the firstborn is the most responsible. This energy force is the energy force where a person becomes overly anxious about not losing themselves. Where we see that the greatest ability to not lose yourself is to lose yourself. When a person is able to let go entirely, when a person is able to kill their firstborn, so to speak, inside of self, this over inundation with having to choose. The word Bechor actually comes from livchor, to choose. When a person removes that aspect of having to constantly choose to retain a sense of existence, when a person lets go of that angst of life, they finally enter into the space of holistic oneness, which is the freedom that then the Jewish people were able to be liberated and come into the space of freedom of their journey to the land of Israel. So please God, Hashem should give us the ability to have this space of breaking free of all of the afflictions that exist inside of self, all of the blockages that exist inside of our spiritual potential and energy. And Hashem should please God, this Pesach, send all of these unblockages, all of these powerful energies that we find within the implicit nature and light of Pesach into our lives to create healing, to create a space of feeling unblocked, to create a sense of clarity, of connection, of patience, of love, of healthy boundary, of deep connection and deep intimacy with life, this consciousness, this ability to not worry. That is what Pesach represents, and that is what true freedom represents. Should be with bracha. Thank you, my dear friends.